Esse é o 6º ano da Marcha do Orgulho Trans e a gente precisa cada ano lutar para estar aqui na rua.
Até com que de fato a nossa cidadania seja conquistada, os nossos direitos sejam assegurados.
Muita gente pergunta por que precisa existir uma marcha trans. E a resposta é muito simples. Por muitas décadas, a população trans é excluída dessas paradas maiores, mais comerciais. A marcha acontecer aqui no centro de São Paulo é um lugar de reivindicação dos nossos direitos.
Em todas as esferas, né? Tanto da saúde, educação, emprego.
Para que esse palco seja ocupado por pessoas trans e toda a equipe trans que produz esse evento.
Essa marcha é a nossa casa e eu estou muito satisfeito, muito feliz por estar aqui fazendo parte.
O TikTok acredita demais na visibilidade que a causa trans precisa. Por isso que a gente está aqui mais um ano para trazer toda a diversidade que a nossa plataforma tem, que escuta absolutamente todas as vozes.
Nos colocar como pessoas aliadas na causa, não só em questão de empregabilidade, como também de visibilidade.
Aqui estamos fazendo educação nas ruas.
Tivemos uma série de avanços, tivemos parlamentares trans eleitas.
E cada vez mais uma força emanada para fazer políticas públicas, ações legislativas e no judiciário, para podermos existir realmente nessa sociedade.
É importante que todas as pessoas, inclusive cisgêneras, aliadas, estejam nesse lugar.
Chame pessoas trans para viver contigo, para trabalhar contigo, para estar contigo na sua vida.
É um dia de muita relevância para a nossa luta, que vai trazer ainda mais orgulho para todos nós.
Eu faço parte do coletivo Mães pela Diversidade, que visa melhorar o mundo para os nossos filhos. Às vezes uma criança não se enxerga em muitos lugares.
A Marcha do Orgulho Trans nos faz perceber que nós não estamos sozinhas nesse mundo.
Então você começa a ver novas perspectivas de vida e ver que tudo é possível.
Nós não somos objetos sexuais, nós somos o que a gente quiser ser.
Eu pude me descobrir, redescobrir o meu universo e me aproximar de pessoas que são como eu.
Várias pessoas incríveis, influenciadores incríveis.
Oi, meus amores! Chegou, irmãs de pau!
Salve, salve, SSEX BBOX!
Não existe travesti fora do Brasil. É uma identidade puramente nacional, está aqui construída no interior dessa cultura. Então não existe Brasil sem travestilidade, não existe Brasil sem o nosso povo trans.
Foi uma visão linda de se ver, de fazer parte. E ter um momento de celebrar a excelência trans, muitos talentos.
Para fortalecer a nossa identidade, as nossas raízes e a nossa ancestralidade.
Porque a narrativa transvestigênero no Brasil não será apenas uma narrativa de dor, perda, mazela e sofrimento. Nós também queremos celebrar a nossa vida.
Onde eu um dia poderia imaginar que eu teria o meu filho. Eu pari o meu filho. Eu nasci no corpo certo, pelo contrário, já que pra ser homem eu tive que não nascer otário. Eu não vou ficar no armário.
Então esse aqui é um pedido de apoio para o poder público para que essa marcha entre para o calendário da cidade.
Nós seguiremos organizadas, marchando em luta e ocupando todos os espaços.
Nesse mês de junho, né, que é o mês do orgulho LGBTQIAP+, é muito satisfatório, né, estar aqui hoje realizando esse evento com painéis tão incríveis, com pessoas tão importantes na cena trans do Brasil.
Então, para mim, é uma imensa gratidão participar de cada pedacinho desses programas e eventos, como a Feira Trans, Conferência Internacional, que está indo para sua 6ª edição.
A Feira Trans, o intuito dela é conectar.
É de estar trazendo o empreendedorismo trans, né, para dentro do cenário.
Acessível para todas as pessoas.
É exatamente buscar um ambiente de relacionamento entre quem produz a arte e quem consome a arte.
Que eu espero que seja um lugar de muito aprendizado e que eu possa escutar muito.
E a Feira Trans tem uma relevância importantíssima em questão de empreendedorismo, em questão de geração de renda.
A gente senta para discutir pautas que são relevantes pra gente, a gente senta para discutir o novo também.
Poder fazer com que o nosso trabalho aconteça em espaços que a gente às vezes não tem oportunidade.
Sou criadora da Naneca, uma calcinha especial para transexual. Já é o 2º ano consecutivo que venho trabalhando com a Feira Trans.
Que traz visibilidade não só para pessoas trans, mas para toda a comunidade LGBTQIAP+.
Esse potencial transformador da sociedade.
É isso, é nós. Fechou parceria.
Esse evento, ele traz a possibilidade de que essas pessoas tenham acesso ao mercado de trabalho e também ao empreendedorismo de pessoas trans. É o que eu digo, não há justiça social sem justiça econômica. É importantíssimo que as marcas que estão aqui realmente estão colocando na prática o que a gente fala de diversidade, equidade, inclusão e pertencimento.
Doritos é uma marca que tem como propósito empoderar as pessoas.
Eu acho que é não deixar ninguém para trás, né?
Debatendo conceitos, ouvindo experiências.
Para que a gente possa projetar esse trabalho e apoiar os empreendedores.
E sei que a gente será ainda mais efetivo se a gente puder fazer isso colaborativamente e coletivamente.
Eu acredito que estamos caminhando para ter a primeira holding só de empreendedores trans e LGBTs.
Então, para a gente é muito importante estar aqui.
Essas pautas, elas são extremamente relevantes.
E essa voz está sendo ouvida, essa voz está sendo assistida.
Ter linguagem para dizer sobre não só o que eu sinto, mas o que eu sou.
E entender que nomenclaturas não me compõem.
Uma vez que o código trans é da liberdade.
It is amazing to have you here again. Welcome everyone to the 6th annual SSEX BBOX International Conference, and it's amazing to be here again with Danielle C. For those who are with us from the beginning, the first SSEX BBOX International Conference here in Brazil, we had the pleasure to have you in person. So 6 years after that, we are here again, and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Pri. Obrigado. Obrigadi. Estou muito feliz de ser junto com você aqui. I'm really happy to be here together again, and I have fond memories of our time 6 years ago, and a lot has happened, and I'm excited to talk about everything with you. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Let's share a little bit of who are you? For those who haven't seen, the L word, I guess there's a generation thing here. Some of the new folks don't really know much about, the series that was back in the day. And I know now there was a new version coming up, a new season, actually. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your trajectory. I really like when you were here back in Brazil, you talk about your relationship with your dad and your queer family. So share with us a little bit.
Okay, well, yeah, my name's Daniel C. I'm an actor, musician, artist. And yeah, I'm best known in some realms, in some circles for a role that I played on a TV series. Back in 2005, I entered a show. It was a melodrama called The L Word, and it was kind of like this mainstream, let's say, lesbian-focused show, and they decided to bring in a character, and it's the first trans-masculine character on US TV, I think generally, in specifically trans-masculine recurring character, and his name is Max, and so that is what I'm most recognized for. But I'll also say that I am a member of queer and trans communities since 1990. So that was already 15 years of living in radical and queer and trans community up until the point where I entered the mainstream art and music communities, specifically of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I also lived in Europe for those years. So I'm not your typical actor that entered in a traditional way. I entered in my early 30s via 15 years of this other kind of living. So yeah, that's, I guess, who I am. I make fine, like conceptual art. I also create music and I also act.
Share with us a little bit about your growing up in the queer family and how it was for you to, come out as trans and how this process happened also in the last few years. There's a lot of changes in that. So share a little bit with us about that.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the 1970s in Los Angeles. My parents were alternative types artists. I lived in the suburbs of Los Angeles with them. My father came out in 1976 when I was 3. That was 3 years after the American Association of Psychologists took being queer or being gay off of the list of mental health disorders and decriminalized it in a sense. So, and it was during the gay revolution. My father saw it all happening in the early part of his marriage, and he finally felt that he could come out. My uncle, my mother's brother, is gay, and he was a colleague of Harvey Milk. He opened the first gay and queer bookstore in the Castro in the early 70s with his partner. So I think my father watched all of that happening and the family's embrace of him and realized that it was time for him to come out, is what he always knew, which is that his attraction to men. And it was an interesting process. For 1 year, we lived together with both my mom and my dad and his boyfriend. And that was really lovely for me as a kid because it was just more love in the house. And eventually, I think for my mom, it wasn't a good situation, and she wanted to move on. So then they divorced. But then my father essentially married, although it wasn't a legal thing to be married at that time. But he did buy a house and live together with his longtime partner, Tom. And we got to spend a lot of time as a family with my brother and my dad and his husband all through the 80s. And I have very fond memories of that. So yeah, the openness of my mom also to what today would maybe be a pansexual experience that my dad was having, an understanding of himself, and also a kind of non-monogamy relationship. But they tried to do it in a context of a very straight suburb, and all the parents knew, their parents, all my grandparents, they knew what was happening. They didn't hide anything, but I think it's hard to sustain out of context like that. I think that they would have thrived in a different way today. But this kind of questioning of what is possible and kind of questioning the rules per se, and knowing that in a way we can trust ourselves and our own inner knowing and the love and understanding of our families and help them to understand who we are. That's kind of the environment I grew up in. And it wasn't perfect by any means. There is still the system that I was growing up in, which was very counter to that. The school that I went to, public school, that was very heteronormative, capitalistic, patriarchal, etc. So it's not as though I was immune to the forces of heteronormativity and what it did to my psyche. I did get to dress how I wanted, which was as a boy, and my mom did go up against several like shopkeepers or school teachers or anything for my right to do that. And I did I oftentimes just wore shorts with no shirt or anything like that for a long time until I wasn't able to anymore. And that was like my first experience of, let's say,
a little tomboy.
Yeah, they would have called me like a little tomboy, but my brother always considered me his little brother. So I think my gender was understood in a subliminal way, even when we didn't have language for it, and I always asserted that in all the games and everything. I was always Sir Daniel. If we played knights, I was always I like to play different roles, let's say. But this is also the link with art, being an artist, which took me a long time to use that word because I associate it with so much elitism and like who can be an artist, who not. I I think everybody's an artist, but I claim it. And so to use that perspective on seeing the world, I gained that from my parents. And it also is what made me creative enough to start to work with my community in the early 90s to come up with language with which to explain who we were. So using words like queer or later coming up with different pronoun possibilities, for example, Zer, or, we were very playful with all of that. And that was a collective creation before it became formulated and went into the academy languaging. It was happening on the streets with working class and also homeless youth. And, a lot of underground is how it ended up in the hands of the academy, and then came back around. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's so beautiful when I go to the Bay Area too, when I, talk with the elders and people who are there during those times when, queer became a thing, and how it's interesting to listen and how it had evolved and how queer theory doesn't have the updates that the queer community and the queer culture have evolved, right? Like there's queer theory, but there's people living lives and experiencing things and evolving, especially with language, right? So how was for you the language thing around identify as trans through your, last few years?
Well, I actually identified as trans from 2001 until 2005. And for me, that meant trans as in transitioning across the spectrum of gender. Now I would say trans as in transitioning across the galaxies of gender, because I don't think it's linear and I don't think it's binary. But when I came into the public eye, which was a big transition for me, let's say, suddenly there was a lot of, from the normal world, let's say, we were living our subversive life. So I never expected the regular mainstream to take on any of the languaging that we were using in community. So things like, people called me he for many years, or she, or, we're very playful, but I never expected the mainstream would at all understand queerness. I thought of it as a subversive thing. So suddenly I was thrust with this job opportunity into the mainstream, and I was being asked, and this is before social media, before the internet was anything more than just email. So everything had to be filtered through these journalists. So when they would ask, like, what your identity, at that time, we were struggling for rights for trans people to get access to medical care. So it was very important to establish at that time this idea of dysphoria, which is something I have experienced in my life, but that being the primary reason that someone should attain healthcare. So that still was not guaranteed for people. So I felt at that time that it was important to not use that as something to describe myself, because I hadn't chosen at that time to use those medical interventions. So then I was kind of left without a word for myself. But, I've been queer since 95, which most people at that time were not. And that was thanks to Queer Nation, which is a radical group that was fighting on behalf of HIV activism and queer rights. And that was always very important to me. Many of my peers and people around me identified as dykes, or my elders were lesbian. But for me, queer was always more appropriate for me. But these subgroups were all interwoven, and people's identities were often somehow fluid as we discovered languaging. And so, and then I just refused to declare anything for quite a few years, other than just queer. But for me, within my community, I've always been understood as being trans. But then when I decided to use the social media and use it more, I'm older, so I'm going to be 50 this summer. So for me, as a radical, the idea of putting my whole life online to be used by whatever people, I wasn't so sure I wanted to do that. And especially in terms of marking myself, which I already thought was so clear, which I'd always declared, which is that, ever since that time in 2005, I always said that I don't prescribe to a binary. But when I finally did, that's when some people interpreted that as me coming out as trans, but actually it was much more complex than that. And when I put the he, they at the top of my little box in the Instagram, suddenly people believed what I'd already been saying was true for 15 years before that. So that was interesting, or 30 years after I came out. That was interesting experience.
The power of pronouns. So you use both pronouns, he and they, right?
Yes, because I am transmasculine. That is kind of my essential gender that I was kind of naturally born with, but I also assert my right to play with gender and to be more playful if I want to wear a dress. I mean, I don't very often, but if I want to be in drag in a feminine way, or in a way like some kind of other being, intergalactic being, or whatever it is I want to play with, for me, being queer is inherently a right to assert all of my imagination and my radical inclinations. So yes, I think it'd be clearer for people if I was clearly, like, if I had a beard and I had more of the muscles and things like that, and then I wore glittery eye makeup, then it's like, oh yes, they're non-binary, but that's who I am. I just, appear in a different way.
Exactly. It's so interesting, the conversation and the language that's being, changed and upgraded around being trans, and what is trans masculinity, for example, right? Some people think trans masculinity and trans man are the same thing, but it's not, because in trans masculinity, we can include people like us. I'm also identifying as trans masculine, as in the trans spectrum, as a non-binary person. So I think that people will have difficulty with language. And I think this connected to also with the word transsexual and transgender, and how there is this intertwined idea that gender and sex are the same thing, when we know they're not, because, sex is in your body and gender is in your head. So I want you to share a little bit about, like, your perception around this, and how, what's your idea around, like, moving around with community on understanding this difference for safe environment, and for creating, like, safe spaces among us ourselves.
Well, when I think about masculinity, as oftentimes people do, I think of my father. My father is a prime example for me, my first example, most closely. My father is very much a mask guy. Like, if you saw him, he had a beard, muscles, he knew how to fix cars, he could do a lot of things. And he is very effeminate in the sense, and he was very motherly. Like, between my mom and my dad, my dad was the one who cared for us in those ways that are usually associated with the mother. Caring for me, feeding me, holding me, all those kind of things. It was more my father's realm. And so for me, this idea that masculinity is any one thing, or that the sex of someone would determine their gender, is like, even from a very primal moment of care as an infant, my father was doing the mothering. So that, my brother is equally so, very much a man, very in the ways that people associate. He's a craftsman, he's a very strong, big guy, and he's very gentle and loving. And I won't say effeminate in his case, but I don't prescribe to the general Eurocentric ideas of masculinity, because a lot of this is actually colonial concepts that were imposed over all of our ancestors at some point, some earlier than others. So for me, my ancestors in Ireland and also in the Viking realms, they didn't also prescribe to a binary gender until they were colonized by the Romans or by the church. So for me, it's also a question of what are the systems at play, and how are these systems benefiting from this idea of a strict binary and everybody must play by the rules, and how that's replicated in queer community, or in, let's say, trans community, bilateral oppression, which can happen where people just get to think they can determine how trans, for example, someone else is. For me, they're weaponizing these colonial systems and heteropatriarchal systems of power. And usually it's to consolidate power, actually, whether we want to face that or not. It's about our own insecurities if we belong. It's about thinking that somehow that there's a scarcity of belonging, and so we must, like, gatekeep. And for me, that's just replicating the kind of policing that as I'm more interested in the older systems. And obviously, if you look at the world around us today with fascism rising, with Bolsonaro winning the election based on weaponizing anti-queer and trans rhetoric, which is exactly what Hitler did, which is exactly what fascism always does, then we know like we need to kill the fascists within ourselves as well, because it exists in all of us. And to say, I believe the simple thing is it's self-determined. Whatever someone says they are, that's what they are. You know, with youth, you might want to use a little bit of a different equation to help. If you see maybe they don't know yet, there's ways we can encourage space for them to find for themselves the truth of themselves. And then lastly, I would say in that same way as the colonial Eurocentric heteropatriarchy operates in a very linear sense of categorization. So when you think of when the colonists came, the European colonists came, they categorized everything. That was the first thing to create property. So they basically wrote down every plant, every person, every nation that was living in these cultures and itemized it so that they could own it. So property is always part of categorization. And that's why sometimes I resist it, because I feel that it is an imposed thing. It doesn't come naturally. I think it's something that's been imposed on us for people to be able to create systems of ownership and power and degradation, and obviously all the really terrible things like enslavement, genocide, etc. I mean, it goes that far, as we see with, for example, Bolsonaro, Trump, Hitler, any of these monstrous people. Yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on it, is that being queer, why I say I'm transmasc, non-binary, and I'm also queer not in the modern sense of some marketing category, but queer in the sense of what I came into it, which meant opposed to systems of oppression and for systems of regeneration. And now I would say decolonization, these kinds of thoughts, you know, for liberation, basically because it's better for everyone. It's this idea that there's only these slim categories and we have to decide, and then we have to live that for the rest of our lives. That's the other thing. It's constantly unfolding. I mean, language is changing, luckily, always. It's forming and transforming and keeps moving. Transformation, trans, for me, means I have the right to be many things at any time, you know? And I think that's more exciting to me as an artist and as a person in community, to just, yeah, be open to people as they change and shift, and you know, whatever they say they are, and then if they want to change it up, that's cool, you know.
Yeah, it's fascinating how language that we use today, it's coming from colonization. You know, when I talk about our work around, you know, creating a neutral language in Portuguese with the ele, gile pronouns and using the e in the end of the words, how people think this is a new thing that started on the internet, and nobody really knows the ancestry around all of this, that all nations, you know, our ancestors from many different countries had the opportunity to, and language, to identify somehow in the spectrum of queerness and not be this heteronormative and cisnormative ways of identifying.
And this is, I think, why we could look to, for example, I mean, my references are often from, you know, what I'm familiar with, which would be Gloria Anzaldúa and Cherie Moraga, who talk about remembering. So, of course, during the colonization process, depending on how long ago it was in certain circumstances, we may or may not have the languages direct or even know who our ancestors are. But we can reimagine and we can create and basically reclaim, also from our own embodied knowledge, you know, reconocimiento, you know, this idea that we can look within our own forms and embody that, and then the knowledge comes from there, which is an anti-patriarchal idea, you know, that our bodies have knowledge and that we could try to remember these ways, because of course there were ways to talk about all of this in the ancient times, and most of the peoples were all over the world.
So what I'm really interested is like bringing to the forefront, you know, the recognition of like two-spirit people, for example, and get the community and the larger bubble, you know, of people understanding that that's part of our history and that's part of our past.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I should say, I should identify this, and I usually do at the beginning, so forgive me, but I do identify as white. I am the descendant of settlers, European settlers on occupied territories in the United States. So it's an ongoing colonial occupation of the entire continents of Americas, but I would just speak in the sense of the US, what was so-called US or Turtle Island territories. And so a lot of what I have been unlearning are systems that I was taught regarding, you know, that are white supremacist systems, which are inherently capitalist, because those two things came in at the same time, white supremacy and racial capitalism, which is the system that I believe we live in today in the US. It's a racial capitalism based on incarceration of Black primarily and brown bodies. That's important to say, and also that it is occupied indigenous territories, much like Brazil. I mean, those lands were never ceded. There were treaties signed which have never been honored by the US government. And so a lot of my understandings regarding any of this have come from Black and brown intellectual and cultural work. It's nothing that I have geniusly thought of. In fact, I feel so lucky to have even encountered and have a small understanding of any of it, because I feel like it saved my life. So encountering people like Angela Davis, you know, the work of the Black Panthers, Gloria Anzaldúa, my teacher and friend Cherie Moraga. There's many people who have helped me, and also my two-spirit relatives in the US that I am related to and in deep community with, have helped me to understand a little bit about, where we're coming from, what's the reality we're living in, because it's a bit like a ghost story or some kind of weird horror or sci-fi. Like in my case, I'm born into this white seeming world, and I don't know that it's basically a kind of, that it's based on segregation is a nice way to say it. It's a kind of, I mean, it's an apartheid system, but that's a tricky word to use because, you know, it's specific to South Africa perhaps, but it you know, Los Angeles was racially segregated based on power lines created by the police, completely monitored, and some people's prosperity are built on other people's being used and abused. So for me, all of this stuff is related. You know, I can't differentiate my understanding of my own gender or place in the world from my spiritual journey or from my ancestral lines, and my implications in that system, and how can I dismantle it, which I am not perfect at. Let's say I'm still implicated and participating in this system. So why I think liberation is important on all aspects, that we work towards liberation in all these ways. Like, I don't believe in a capitalist liberation. I don't think that's possible. I do think we can use these systems in different moments, get funding for things, projects, whatever. I'm not a purist, but I also think that it's only full system change, which prioritizes equality or full liberation. Could we really be free as trans and queer people and not do these things to each other, like saying someone's not trans enough, you know, or whatever. So that's what I would say about that. There's a lot of knowledge and understanding that my two-spirit relatives particularly have given to me about their lines, which I'm not co-opting. It's not my story, but it's a way to understand what possibly some version of my ancestors could have been doing back in the day. And there's more and more research that proves that as well for all over the globe, when they look at the burial sites and things, that shows there's many different kinds of relationships, and different people wearing the different genders clothing, like even in ancient times and in Viking burials, for example. So yeah, it's something like that. Does that answer what you were saying?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a big topic. We could be here days, you know, approaching from different perspectives. And I think it's interesting when you think about the identity and expression of gender, and how it's viewed only by this, you know, cis heteronormative way, right? It's what it's in the mainstream. So I think it's our responsibility as queer community to have those conversations for clarity of vision, for clarity of understanding who we are and what identity really is, because it boils down for me, at least in my process, also to identify as a trans person, that my identity was a spiritual process. I identify as a non-binary because it was a deep experiencing with ayahuasca, for example, that brought me the knowledge of who am I and why do I have both sacred parts, like it was the yin and yang. It's both in me, and how, you know, all these years has been my journey to achieve somehow that, not just in my body, but in my character, in the building of, you know, my ego as a human being incarnated at this time, you know. And it's really fascinating. And I want to actually share with you a piece, a video that a scientist that I really like, Bruce Lipton, is sharing a little bit about research on cells, membranes, and how actually the body and the identity are connected in this way. And I think it's really fascinating. So maybe you can watch the clip and talk a little bit about it.
Sure.
Okay.
So this question is, if reincarnation exists, how is it possible to communicate with the spirit of a deceased person, ? Where are they at that point, ? And what is the relationship between that point and reincarnated life? And they put love hearts. They put love hearts.
It's a very interesting and exciting question for me, because as a scientist all my life I did not believe in spirituality. And I was into genes and chromosomes and cells and all that stuff. But in understanding the nature of that membrane that I talked about in the lecture, I started to recognize something which I'm going to talk about tomorrow as well, and that is our identity is not inside our body. Our identity is picked up by protein antennas on the surface of our cells. The reality is our source is from the outside, and the signals get picked up by the proteins and then control the cells on the inside. The significance for me at that moment, besides the shock of, oh my God, I'm not in here, was the simple reality that I said, oh my, it's like the body is like a television set and there's a broadcast coming in. And the relevance about that is sometimes the television breaks, you say the television's dead. And I say, yeah, but is the broadcast still there? And the answer is, indeed, the broadcast is still there. That doesn't change because the body comes and goes. And I said, well, what about it? And I said, well, since we're being picked up by a specific set of proteins called antennas, self-receptors is the biological name, the relevance is, what if a future embryo comes with the exact same set of self-receptors? No two people have the same set of self-receptors. I have to tell you right now, no two people are receiving the same broadcast. And the significance is that if an embryo shows up with the same set of self-receptors, then you're back online again. Now, can you communicate with them? Not through the physical means, because they're not communicating with physicality to us. Now, if you get your recognition, as we talked about, mind is not even in the body. If you get your mind in the outside, there's an opportunity at a level to communicate. Let me just add this one, because this is an exciting story to emphasize the nature of that we're still there. There's a number of studies of people who have heart transplants. And when they receive a transplant for somebody else, they start to pick up characteristics of the person who donated the heart. Now, some people say that's cellular memory. As a cellular biologist, I think you're giving great credit of memory to a cell. A cell is lucky to remember if it's a liver cell or a skin cell, not if it likes chicken McNuggets and beer, okay? But the story I just want to emphasize and close it with is simply this. A young girl received a heart from another young girl. And once the heart was implanted, just shortly after, she had very vivid nightmares of being murdered. And they repeated themselves every night. And so finally, the doctor said, well, where did this heart come from? And it was from another girl who was murdered. And the relevance about that was the nightmares were so vivid that when the police questioned her about what she had seen, they were able to catch the killer. The point was the heart cells are still having the self antennas of the person who has died. And so as long as the heart was still present, it was downloading the identity into that heart. And the relevance is, yes, the girl's dead, but she's still there. Why? Because if the heart has the receptors, it still shows that there's a source that's feeding this individual person. Between all this particular data, it is profoundly important to understand the nature of some quantum physics, energy fields, and identity, and that we are not in this body. We are being broadcast to this body. To close, my second closing now, I think. The second closing was, as a scientist, and not spiritual for 40-some years, and then in 1 minute after understanding the nature of the membrane, it's like 2 + 2 is 4. I'm not in here. It was oh my God, I'm not here. And that concept of being outside, then being immortal, was interesting. But then I wanted to add this part because I thought this was the exciting part about my connection with my spirit and my body. I asked myself as a scientist, I said, well, why have a body and a spirit? Why not just be spirit? Well, at that moment, 50 trillion cells welled up. An answer came right up through those cells. And that's when I recognized I had Jewish cells. I asked a question, and the cells answered with a question. And they're very funny cells, so here's how it goes. I said, why have a spirit and a body? Why not just be a spirit? And the cells welled up and said, Bruce, if you're just a spirit, what does chocolate taste like? And if you get the answer for that is this is a virtual reality suit. You jump into the suit, you drive it around, the experiences of this suit are sent back to source. That's where we start to recognize your brain activity is not contained in your head. You can use magnetoencephalograph probes outside of your head, and you can read your brain activity. So you're broadcasting back to the field. And that's why we can see a sunset. We can taste that chocolate. We can smell that rose. And then all of a sudden it says, oh my God, we came here to experience life and to create. And then all of a sudden I said, oh, the whole story might be the biggest cosmic joke in the world, and that is this. We have been told that when we die, if we did a good job on planet Earth, we can go to heaven. I would like to suggest something. You were born into heaven. This is where you came to create. This is where you came to experience. If you don't like the creation, the significance, as we talk about between Joe and Greg and myself, is we're not living our lives, we're living the lives of programs. And if you don't like the program, the new biology is the one that says you can rewrite it. And if you rewrite it to make your creation not the one you bought as the creation, you will manifest heaven on earth. You will wake up every day with the glory of being in the most spectacular planet and the ability to create life. And that's what the joy is all about. Thank you.
All right. Just going a little deeper here on this conversation on identity. Want to hear what's your take around identity and the body and the idea that we're being broadcast to our own selves, and identity is not in our bodies itself.
In my spiritual practice of meditation and working with medicines also, and I have discovered that to be true for myself, that the more I cannot see those things as separate, and the more I can see actually nothing as separate, the more I am living in truth. So I don't even think there's different places, if you will, or different people. I mean, we have these individualities, but we're also literally all united as one. So I think that the juxtaposition between those two things, like I was talking before about self-determination, being able to be my truest self and declare my gender and do what I feel to do as long as I'm not hurting anyone. But also I am inherently connected and everything I do affects others. But yeah, I'm not so sure about broadcast. That didn't really help me so much in terms of understanding my own identity, but I think he's basically touching on some universal truths that some of the wisdom of the elders who have that passed down understand in very in-depth ways, and maybe just trying to translate it into a scientific language for the Western mind, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's exactly that, because when we can use science to explain what our ancestors are saying and all, the people who are being oppressed, I guess some part of the mainstream would take this as validation. So I guess it's time to science to validate the stories that are there somehow, right? And they're getting into this point. I believe that science is actually able right now, it depends of kind of science. Let's say there's more not mainstream science, would be able to talk about spirituality and identity in a very different way in these days.
Yeah. And also to remember that, like, one of the biggest leaps in terms of understanding the structure of DNA happened by a scientist who was on acid. So using LSD, and all of the computers and everything that we're using is from a psychedelic culture of the Bay Area, people using psychedelics in order to understand the nature of very practical things. And here we are speaking on a computer and filming it and doing all this stuff. And so, what are these different modes or technologies in order to access understanding ourselves in the universe? How are they tangible? Well, in that case, that's, a bunch of hippies dropping acid who are also computer programmers who are able to understand deep things about genetics, which is what we use in all over the world now for scientific and medical reasons, and the same with the computer stuff. So, it can sound very space, like, oh, psychedelics, or like you were talking about sacred medicine of ayahuasca, which for me is a psychedelic in a sense, although it's also its own entity as a plant being that's out there working and healing and doing the work of the creator or Mother Earth or something. But also you could see it as a psychedelic in terms of giving you direct access to the nature of the universe in an experiential way. I think it can be very useful, and it's not lost on me that certain lines of queer theory and everything is coming also from psychedelic people who are working with psychedelics, including my parents. It's kind of the unspoken intellectual line, which is underneath certain forms of thought, intellectual thought, that I feel like I'm the descendant of from my parents, for example, generation.
Yeah, it's very transformation times, and I believe those medicines also had the power to help us in the process of seeing it clear to what we are in this time, what's happening, and why the gender conversation it's so vivid right now. Before, I don't know, decades ago, I believe the transformation that we facing is gonna go through gender, and I think that's the essential part of this process that we're facing.
For me, I would say that using the medicines is something that really helped me in a very difficult time in my life, because I didn't go to them for fun or something, I went because I needed help. And actually a doctor friend of my mom brought me to drink my first ayahuasca experience. I never took LSD or anything like that, but I have experienced that medicine in ceremonial traditional settings. I don't recommend it as a kind of a party drug or something, because it's a sacred being. But I would say that who I am today is greatly, that I'm here at all, that I'm still alive, but also that the way I see the world is greatly helped by the ancient wisdoms that also cultures of indigenous people were caretakers of for millennia, for time immemorial. So I'm very grateful for that as well, you know. And I hope to do it some kind of justice, or the things that I have received that I be able to give back in a good way. But I'm not sure if I do that, but I hope so.
That's the hope, right? Giving it back
Yeah.
to the universe.
Yeah.
It's so good
And that
to
love,
have.
I guess, I just want to say something that occurred to me earlier. We were talking about all this identity stuff and lateral oppression and different things, and believing people that they are what they say they are. But I also want to say that kindness and being loving and learning how to be loving to ourselves and other people, for me, it's a lifelong learning that I'm trying to learn more and more how to do it, you know. And I think that's one way that we can dismantle all of these harmful power structures, because love is really what the universe is made of, and it's who we are. So everything else is like kind of not that, you know. There is that pure love, and to learn how to love and be kind to myself within my own mind, and to learn how to be kind to other people in their processes, and understanding and forgiving. That's, I think, really what we need to, I believe, use as like the primary under everything of the liberation quest is kindness, you know. It goes a long way.
Yes, I believe
just be
that
gentle
so
with each
much.
other, you know. Just be
Yes.
gentle, be kind. We don't have to call anyone out or scream, or, I mean, sometimes you have to yell. Okay, anger is also really important, but, you know, I think we could be more tender even when we are having to call someone out, you know.
Yes, we can call them in. I guess I like that version
Yeah.
of calling them in.
Mhm.
And remind me of a phrase that I use so much in my workshops and talks from Audre Lorde. She said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And I guess we can close with that idea of how lateral oppression and replicating the system of oppression and not being kind to each other as a community, as trans community, has creating so much separation. And I think it's time to heal that, all that trauma, right?
Yeah, and help us to understand each other. You know, I had a whole experience in the media of being misgendered, and none of those journalists ever reached out to me to clarify anything. They believed some quote that was misquoted, that was in Wikipedia, that I could never change. And they never did the simple, and a lot of them were very, like, they knew someone I knew. There was no reason for them not to contact me. But the results of that was like a year and a half of a lot of pain and suffering on my part, of feeling shamed. And it brought up all of the things from my childhood of like, I'm doing gender wrong, you know, that I've done something wrong, or all this stuff, you know, to be kind of finger pointed, like that I was a cisgendered person playing a trans role or this or that, you know. And I think if they would have just been a little kinder or humble, they could have just called me to clarify, and I would have given them all the information I gave you. So that's, and those were queer and specifically trans people who wrote those articles. So I have experienced in a direct way the results of this kind of very public thing, and you know, they've all since apologized, and I've got a chance to clarify all of that. But it did take a lot of work, and it was, you know, shame exists in all of us, and it can be played with, and we have to, you know, it was a journey. It's a spiritual thing, and I feel like I came on the other side in a deeper way. But you know, sometimes we have to assert our right to be, because people will want to take us down, you know, and we have to assert it in a strong and kind way. You could be strong and kind at the same time, I found.
Yeah, strong and kind. I like that. That's my goal. That's what I want to be when I grow up.
Sim, eu também. E eu também queria falar um pouco em português, mas essas coisas que nós falamos é mais difícil para mim. É mais simples para mim para falar coisas de comida e coisas simples. Mas para mim, esses 6 anos que eu aprendendo português, esse processo abre muito para mim, em minha mente, muitos conhecimentos do Brasil que eu recebi do música, do coisas teoréticas e também as conhecimentos do toque, do carinho, tudo isso para mim é uma medicina muito profundo e E para mim, eu recebi muito meus amigos e também sim, das músicas, da tudo. E eu queria falar isso, que eu sou muito agradecimento, tem muito
Agradecida.
agradecida desse processo que eu recebi essas coisas bonitas.
Sim, eu
do
também.
Brasil, diretamente. E para mim isso também as linhas afrodescendente e também indígena e também europeu, pode ser, mas esses conhecimentos são muito preciosos para o mundo. O mundo precisa isso muito, eu acho.
Sim, o Brasil pode
Remédio,
ser o berço de muitas dessas culturas e transformações para o futuro, com a floresta, com a medicina da floresta, com a sabedoria e tecnologia da floresta, não é mesmo?
Sim, e sabedoria do carinhos também, da família e das pessoas lá. Para mim, essa é muito bonito, tem muito que aprender para mim ainda, mas sim, queria falar isso. Eu sou muito feliz de conhecer você e também para retornar, para ser aqui no SSEX BBOX 6 anos depois com você e quero neste ano, eu quero ao vivo para abraçar as pessoas lá e ser juntos, festejar e tudo. Porque estamos juntos, sim?
Estamos juntos, sim.
Estamos juntos. Sim.
Isso. Eu acho que é muito bom mesmo esse lugar do afeto que a gente tem no Brasil ali. É um lugar que a gente pode, talvez, sarar muitas das feridas se a gente conseguir, né? Ficar em kindness, em abraço, em amor, porque o mundo está precisando disso.
E também coisas intelectuais também. Eu falei isso antes, mas eu quero falar isso também. É muito exquisite. I don't know how to say. It's very exquisite. The theories and intellectual lines from Brazil that are very advanced, and a lot of the learning that I've done these last years, also in school, comes from Brazil. People like Jaider Esbel or Jota Mombasa or several other people. I can't name them all now, but it's not just cariños. It's also very intellectually high theories and everything. Queer theory and everything.
Good balance between all of those.
Yeah.
Any final messages to finish?
Just, I will say it in English because I want to be more precise about it, but just to say, these are very intense times, the way I see it. We are in a time of fascism rising and coming in different waves in different places. So it's very important for us to be united together as trans people, and then also maybe as queer people, and then also as all people. But we're specifically here to say, in terms of trans and queer community, for us to learn these ways of being together, because there's a lot coming for us, and it's only us, in my experience, coming from queer underground for all those years, it's only us that will save us. It's only us that can rise above this and support each other. So it's like every time someone falls, we need to pull each person up and keep everyone up from falling under these intense circumstances of capitalism, late stage capitalism that's falling, and also the fascism that's using us to consolidate power. So this kindness and this fierceness is important in this way also for our own survival, I feel. And it's an honor. It's actually, I feel very lucky to be in community with you, Pri, and with all the people I met at SSEX BBOX, a lot of which have become good friends and over the years, and generally in the world, to be in queer and trans community. It's a real gift. And so if we feel bad about ourselves, which may happen, let's keep reminding each other that we are beautiful and the world needs us. It needs our trans magic, our queer magic. The world really needs it right now, even my brother told me that. He's like, we need you guys because you're the ones who can guide the way, So that's what I would say. And I'm excited to return to Brazil soon, I hope, and to see you and some of our friends and meet some people I haven't met yet. If there's people watching this, I look forward to meeting you, and I thank you for listening.
Yeah, let's make that happen, and let's embrace queer magic. Let's make that a goal.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you, Pri.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody who organized the Sex Box and everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for watching this.
Beijos. Tchau.
Bem-vindo ao EAD LGBTQIA+, do Identidades Box.
É difícil dentro de uma empresa você falar eu sou lésbica, eu acho. Não sei, por exemplo, como é dentro de uma fábrica falar que você é sapatão.
Eu acho que a palavra travesti assusta algumas marcas. Mas eu não posso usar uma máscara de uma coisa que eu não sou. Eu não sou mulher. Eu sou uma travesti.
Vamos entender o que cada letrinha do acrônimo LGBTQIAP+, significa?
Por una razón política, me identifico como un hombre trans y me identifico como una persona bisexual. Creo que los hombres trans estamos invisibilizados dentro de las agendas LGBT. Creo que las personas bisexuales ni siquiera aparecemos ni siquiera en el lenguaje.
Eu me identifico enquanto bissexual e pansexual.
Eu me considero mulher, trans, intersexo. E quando nós falamos intersexo, ninguém sabe o que é e às vezes até nos vê como uma aberração.
Eu nunca tive muito essa questão com o do não ser homem, ou não é homem de verdade.
Ser uma mulher negra procurando trabalho já é difícil. Principalmente porque quando eu falo que eu sou graduada, tem gente que acha que é mentira, duvida da graduação que eu fiz.
O sexo virou um jogo, uma moeda de troca, um produto e um objeto, né? Então, a sexualidade percebe isso com muita eficiência na sociedade.
So I think in some ways all the movement that's happened, all the trans activists, it's made room in the world for not just trans people. It's given all of us permission to step outside the boxes and to not conform to these very, very confining notions of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman.